sorry. Okay. All right. How are you so far? We good on these two sentences? How they're different? Might be helpful. Does everyone know what the morning star and the evening star are? Let's maybe explain that just in case anyone doesn't actually know what that is. The morning star is Venus when it's Venus as seen when rising in the eastern sky in the morning, and the evening star is Venus seen in the western sky, going down at the end of night. So they look like different things. It's just they look like two different stars in effect, right? There's a star low in the sky in the east, first thing in the morning. There's a star low in the sky first thing in the evening, right? The discovery is that the morning star and the evening star actually refer to the same thing. They both refer to Venus, right? So they're the same object, but they're called something really different. And different. I'm using name here in a very loose sense. We'll come up with a much more technical sense in a second. But they're different names for the same thing, and the discovery that we make is that those two different names refer to the same object. And in this case, it's Venus. And that's the sense in which it's a discovery or an advancement on the stockpile of knowledge. Now, someone in the chat was asking about how this sort of a little bit relates to Nietzsche a little bit. And yeah, like, so if you're doing the Nietzsche thing, you're not going to be super into any of this, because Nietzsche's basic move is that our language is sort of an arbitrary imposition put upon the world, right? That was the basic point of Truth and Lies in an extramoral sense, is that our language are the names we come up with for things. Those are just arbitrary impositions upon the world that don't really tell us anything about the world. Frege's working from basically the opposite assumption. Indeed, language is the medium through which everything gets known, right? But when we actually know it is where our naming properly corresponds with the actual structure of the world, right? So think of language in this sort of sense. Language is the framework that we interpret the world through. Right? And knowledge consists in getting that right, having our language match up with the actual structure that the world has. So against the end, let's maybe do another comparison against the pragmatic philosophers, right? Who we were reading last week. So James, right? Here, this is very much a correspondence theory of truth, right? Our language says stuff. Our language says the morning star is the same thing as the evening star, and what would make that true is the evening star and the morning star being the same thing. Right? So in that sense, it is very much a correspondence account of truth. Again, let's just pause for a second. How are we doing? Questions, thoughts, comments? All right. So Frege's goal is to basically explain how this is possible. How is this difference actually possible? And to do it, he introduces a series of distinctions. Again, I'm going to start erasing, so let me know if you don't want anything erased. All right. So first thing, we're going to have to talk about a sign or a name. And this is just a linguistic unit. The evening star that series of letters. Right? So the pure sort of linguistic piece. Right? We want to distinguish that from the sense of the sign. So what's the sense of the evening star, the star that you see in the western sky first thing in the morning? Oh, sorry, first thing in the evening. Sorry. And then distinguish that again from the reference of the sign, which is Venus. It turns out you wouldn't, maybe you don't necessarily know that right away, but it turns out that is indeed the reference. Right? And what we mean by this is the object. The object in the world that corresponds to the name. I have a chat question. Let me take a look here. Let's talk about that later. Yeah, so okay, so we've got these distinctions, and then he also distinguishes these things from what he calls the idea. What you think of in your head when you think of the evening star. And so let's just, I think we should be able to get through all three of these today, or all four of these today at least. So let's start playing just with these distinctions, and we might not get to whether or not to how all this applies to sentences, but we can at least, I think we should have enough time to, at least to get through this today. Right. So a sign and a name, this is a purely conventional linguistic artifact. We can come up with whatever names we want for whatever we want. The sense of it, though, is also therefore going to be conventional in a sense, but it's not subjective. That's the key thing that Frege wants to argue. Think of this as the meaning of those conventional signs. It's conventional in a loose sense that one, it's just predicated upon the conventional linguistic artifact. It's also conventional that maybe like it's accidental that our culture talked about the evening star in the first place. You don't have to talk about it, or you don't have to describe Venus that way. But if you do describe Venus that way, it's not merely conventional. You're describing an actual feature of the world that is shareable. And it can also be analyzed. Right? It could indeed be possible that you could say, okay, so the star that first appears in the morning, great, right? All right, that's what it is. But you could also say, but that doesn't correspond to anything real in the world. Or you could say that's just a fiction, or you could say any one of a number of things. We can in a sense talk about it. And so someone asked in the chat, well, but isn't meaning intrinsically subjective because it requires us to agree upon it? Not exactly. Like Frege doesn't really think that's the case. Again, it's conventional maybe as a result of it relying upon a kind of common agreement, but being conventional doesn't make it subjective. They're not the same thing. Subjective, let's maybe see if this helps at least with that. Let's see if this helps at all. So the idea is purely subjective. Right. What I think of when I think of the evening star will never be the same as what any other person thinks of. maybe what you think is this sort of like bright orb in a nice dusky sky, whereas I'm thinking about a cloudy night with one little star barely flickering in the distance, or whatever, right? Like this, the idea is kind of like what you imagine. And Frege doesn't even think that's actually shareable with another person. I can never really share the image I have of something inside of my head with you, because I'm going to have to describe it in words that are going to edit out all the sensory details in a very real sense. And so these can't even be shared, he doesn't think. Not even in art. Because everyone, say if you're reading a poem, and it's got to be, again, we're talking about language units here, so it would have to be, it can't be like a visual art. What you imagine might not even, is probably not what the author imagined when they were writing the poem. And sort of can't be. Not just that in principle cannot be the same, because if they were the same, right, you'd have to be the same person. Right? There's all the same idiosyncrasies. There will always be differences. Indeed, we can't even really have access to anyone else's imagining or idea at all. So, Mia, was that helpful? Did that help at all?
Wait, can I clarify a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm kind of asking like, so sense is the meaning of the signs, but is it not subjective because meanings aren't subjective? That was kind of my question.
Oh yeah. I mean, Frege's claim is that that meaning is. I mean, he never says sense means equals meaning. He never exactly does that. But yeah, I mean, what he means by sense is not supposed to be something that's subjective, and so therefore meaning is not subjective. If I'm right in characterizing this as a kind of meaning, like the idea is that the star you see when you see the star you see in the western sky first in the evening, like that thing, it's objective in the sense that we can all talk about whether or not we're seeing any object that corresponds to it. Maybe try this. Let's see if this one helps.
That was pretty helpful. But yeah, you can give another example.
Square circle, right? This has a sense, an object that's both a square and a circle. Right? And that's not subjective. Like it's again, it's conventional. It's dependent upon the meaning of the words square and circle, right? But that square circle refers to an object that is both a square and a circle. That's not that's not subjective, right? That's just like any. You can almost think of it like it's a condition that's going to have to be satisfied by any such object that is properly called the square circle. One condition that it will have to satisfy is that it will have to be both a square and a circle. There might be other conditions it has to satisfy too, but at the very least, it will have to satisfy those. And part of what makes this not objective, square circle has a sense, but it has no reference. Right? It might not even have an idea. Like you might not even be able to imagine anything, though you could perhaps come up with something vaguely that you imagine when you hear the thought, like maybe like a square with like vaguely bent lines or something, right? So maybe it even has an idea, but it has no reference. Reference is, this is where we're actually sort of moving in the direction of truth. What in the world are we actually talking about, right? What, if anything, we should say, corresponds to the name? Because there are things like square circles that actually have no reference. Right? Because the meaning that's picked out by the word square and circle put together in that way corresponds to no possible object. So again, does that help? Does that?
Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
Okay, awesome, good. How's everyone else doing? Are these distinctions making sense to start with?
I have a little bit of a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How is this different than sign signifier signified when in terms of like from like Saussure and structuralism?
It is similar. I would say the yeah, it's actually that's not, and it's not going to be. This is not. This is going to have to be a provisional answer. It
Okay.
won't be a once and for all answer, but at least a provisional answer anyway. It's different because what he means by the reference is way more truthy than what I think Saussure means by the signified.
Okay. I mean, I kind of understand that. I was just wondering because they both use very similar things. Because I know this is like the like prelude to like the semiotic triangle, specifically these three.
It is, yes. It is indeed the
And
prelude to it.
and
Interestingly,
I
Russell
know,
doesn't like this. Russell's whole move is he wants to get rid of sense. He thinks
yeah.
he thinks sense is this unnecessary linguistic, unnecessary remainder of linguistic stuff. So a lot of Russell's early stuff is at least trying to argue against senses and say that we can just get by with references, and names.
No, but I was just wondering about that because it does seem very similar to what I mean. I know I think Saussure came after Frege, but
I believe so. I believe that's right. Yeah. I mean, so
I
we'll
think
see a little bit more when we start talking about how this applies to sentences. So right
okay.
now, everything that we're saying is just applying to like literally like what he calls proper names.
Yeah.
We're going to be able to use all the same language to talk about next class period sentences. And that's where it's going to get really weird. And maybe we'll see a little bit more the force of it being what I was saying was a little truthier. We might be able to sort of see what I mean by that, I guess, a little bit more next time when we start talking about what's going on with how these distinctions work in sentences.
With the thought.
With the relationship between the thought and what the reference of the sentence actually just is the truth value of the sentence, he says.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll have a lot more work that we'll need to do to get to that point. But
okay,
again,
yeah.
at least as a provisional hint, maybe anyway. That's a provisional hint in that direction, at least. Good. Any others? This is probably a pretty good place to stop, actually, because the next thing I was going to go to was actually going to be sentences, and that'll be a bit more. So, all right, if no one has, so one last little point before we go then. So important thing to note here, Frege, in the course of drawing all of this, he's continually pointing out that this is what's true ideally. It's not actually necessarily the case in normal English. In normal English, the boundaries between these things are going to get blurred all the time. And that was what was going on basically in the second half of today's reading, when he just starts looking at all these sentences in such minute, picayune detail. And you're like, what the hell is the point of any of this? Why does any of this matter? But the reason why it actually matters is that what he's showing is that natural language doesn't actually live up to the standards of clarity that like a language would need to live up to in order to actually be clear. And we'll see that a lot more when we start talking about like sentences next time. You can make a lot of sentences in English that seem as if they're saying one thing, but really are saying three different things. They're really making three distinctly different claims. That's really going to make it confusing to say what is the sense of this sentence and what is the reference of this sentence, if what looks as if it's one claim is actually three, or what looks as if it's one claim is two. And so what his constant goal is, and it's aspirational, he doesn't think he's done it or anything, but his goal is to come up with a purely like purified logical language in which every word is just going to have one referent. It can maybe still have a multiple of senses, but it's at least going to have one referent. And every sentence is also going to have just one referent, and to be expressing just one thought. All right. So that's it that's all I have for today, at least. Does anyone have anything else for me?
I had one more clarifying question. I don't know
go ahead.
if it's relevant for anyone else. If people want to leave.
No, go ahead.
But basically, I just want to make sure I understand the difference between like sense and idea. So would it be fair to say that like we all have the same sense of like an apple that is in front of us, but our idea of it would be different, or is that like oversimplified?
You could maybe let's so yeah, well, okay, the way you said it was a little ambiguous. Maybe let's try this and see if this way of, I think it's saying a very similar point. But so if I was to say an app, that red fruit that tastes really good, we all mean the same thing by that little expression, but I might be picturing like that one apple that I had when I was 5, and you might be remembering that one apple you had yesterday, and someone else might be thinking of that time they went bobbing for apples and how good that apple tasted or whatever. Like the specific image we have of that sweet tasting red fruit, that's going to be different, but we all mean the same thing by the redness of it, the sweetness of it, right? Like we just we would gauge whether or not something was an apple by the same standard in all the cases, despite the fact that specifically what we imagine will differ.
Okay, so is he saying like properties are not subjective, or am I?
Yeah, that's at least the right direction. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And so when we distinguish, give me 1 second, Weston, but we'll go over there though. You'll be nice. When we go back to the evening star and the morning star, right? Like when you say the evening star, you're talking about Venus, but you might not explicitly even know that you're doing that. What you take yourself to be talking about is the star that comes up first thing in the morning, or first thing in the evening rather. Same thing when you're talking about the morning star, you're talking about the star that comes up first thing in the morning. Right? You have no idea in that case, or you might not have any idea what the reference is of either of those ideas. And yet either of those senses, but because of the two senses, because they are clear and distinct, you can discover that they're the same thing. You can discover that Venus actually is the thing that satisfies both of those as conditions. You can almost think of the sense as like a set of conditions for the thing that's been named.
Okay, I think that makes sense. So like senses help us understand if the reference is like true or not.
In a sense, though, they even more generally speaking, like most of the time we're just talking about senses. Like most of the time we might not eat like what you mean. Here's another example. H2O is water. Right? But most of the time when you say water, you don't mean a chemical compound. They happen to be the same thing. H2O and water happen to be the same thing. But most of the time when you're talking about water, you have the sense of it, of this sort of like this liquid that like maybe tastes a certain sort of way and has certain kinds of properties to it. So okay. H2O and water, they have different senses. Mm-hmm. H2O has the sense of, 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Water has the sense of maybe this fluid, this fluid that's sloshing in my cup or whatever. They both are the same referent, but again, you might not even know that right away. But because they both of those senses are like determinate and objective, we could then investigate if water satisfies both of them.
Okay, so there could be like multiple senses. Oh yeah, that's what you said in the beginning of class, that there could be like multiple senses, but we can't know all of them. Okay.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Weston, go ahead.
Just to clarify, so we don't need to know like if our ideas are true, right? Like if
your ideas aren't true. Yeah, that's for Frege, our ideas wouldn't be true at all.
We don't like if to even make the distinction of it, right? To like say like when we both think of the time we ate an apple, I'm thinking of the one time when I was 5 years old and you're thinking of last night. Mm-hmm. Like we don't need to know those were true to make the distinction.
Yeah, because in a sense they're not even really true. Truth is going to have to do with reference, with the reference basically. So it's not. But yeah, like it doesn't. I can be imagining whatever I'm imagining. You can be imagining whatever you're imagining when you imagine an apple. So long as we both have the same conditions that we're using to identify something as an apple, those conditions are going to be objective and almost just like verified by us, like both picking up the same thing or something. That's what will actually matter in the process of discovering what an apple actually is or something, what its proper reference is.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm out.
Cool.
I actually have a one more minor thing when it comes to the sign/name.
Yeah.
Is it arbitrary like in structuralism?
He doesn't really get into that, at least in this work. I imagine he would think so, though. I don't know why he wouldn't think it, because he does say that, like, yeah, it's all. He at least does say that it's conventional at the very least. So that would seemingly imply that it's pretty arbitrary. I mean,
well, and with it being purely conventional, that's the. I'm trying to figure out how this is different, because right now I'm not really seeing how it's different.
and I'm not actually sure exactly how different that it actually is.
Yeah.
When he gets down the sort of nuts and bolts, I think the difference is going to be in how reference is working.
Yeah, because it's not the same as signified.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the part where it's
which is really weird, because the other name for signified is referent.
Right. Yeah. And you couldn't. I mean, this is all German, so it's in Frege at least it's all translation anyway. But what's gonna be so weird is the way when he says that every true sentence has the exact same referent. I don't think at all anyone would say that every true sentence signifies the same thing.
Yeah. I don't think either, but it's just one of those things where it just seems strange. We had to read the thought for metaphysics, so.
Oh, okay. So you've already done the thought. Perfect.
Extreme. I'm not so sure I understand it very well. I was just wondering about this because I had brought it up and was kind of told that they're very, very different, and I still don't see a difference even with these distinctions. So that's.
Let's try it. Let's keep going.
We'll see on Wednesday.
Yeah, let's continue it on Wednesday and see where we get. Because we might start working. I might have people read the thought anyway, and maybe we'll start working on it on Wednesday, because we got a little bit farther than I thought we would today, actually. But yeah,
and I mean the thought is hard too.
It is. It is not. I mean, he's doing some sort of like some weird mathematics stuff there, but we'll see how far we get with all of this stuff.
I mean, I think I have a pretty good understanding of what we talked about today, but it's just that nagging feeling of but they're not that different, which I mean would make sense because they're both working in semiotics, and so I understand why they're not different. It's just with Saussure, he's basically saying that you can't know truth because of this.
Right. Whereas Frege is saying the opposite.
Whereas Frege, you can know truth because of this.
Actually, he's more said like truth is this. That's what's gonna be super weird.
Okay, is that well? I mean, that's changes kind of how I see it, but it's still kind of weird when you think of how both are using it for opposite things.
Yeah, that's right. Because like, I think what Frege is, I don't want to claim to know Saussure that well. So I'm just very cursory understanding of him. But at least like what's going on in Frege is like he's basically just saying all sentences are veridical. And all language, so therefore, at least all declarative sentences are.
And I mean, Saussure also would argue the same thing. You can, but it all turns around and says everything's false because the arbitrariness of the sign.
Right. Whereas he's gonna say the opposite.
Yeah.
Exactly. He's gonna say the exact opposite because the arbitrariness of the sign is irrelevant because what matters is the referent of the sign, which is gotten at through the sense of the sign, and the sense of the sign isn't arbitrary.
Well, and that's where it gets weird, and maybe because of structuralism and the sense.
Let me add something to that. The sense isn't arbitrary within a language.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Say that. That's true. Um,
And so
true, air
therefore,
quotes.
within a language, truth.
Yeah. I don't know. We'll get more into it, and if I continue seeing weird stuff, I'll continue bugging you about it.
Sounds good. Yeah, like I said, there's a limit to my knowledge of Cesar, but yeah, I mean,
I
But
mean,
yeah, at
and
least-
that's fine. And that's fine. I mean,
at least I think I can do the
Zashir
Frege
is-
side reasonably well, at least.
Well, I mean, Zashir is definitely a weird one because
Yeah.
when you start adding words to words, it gets real
Right.
weird.
Right. Yeah.
I have a feeling it's going to do the same thing with Frege.
It's gonna get weirder than you would
Weirder.
think. Yeah. Yeah, it's gonna get weirder than you would think.
Well, for example, when we were discussing this, it was something along the lines of the small bowl. So each individual word would be considered a sign,
Hmm.
and each individual thing would have its own referent, and that's where it gets all kind of wonky because depending on where the words are in the sentence, the bowl small would mean like, well, is the bowl small or is everything else small around the bowl? Or
Yeah, right,
and that's
right,
where
right.
you get into that weird ambiguity of language.
Yeah, I don't
Or the small bowl that is tall, or the bowl that is tall that is small, and they mean different things, but they're the same word.
right. Yeah,
and
and what
yeah.
he's gonna actually say is that the both the sense and the referent are different in all of those cases.
Yeah.
So it's actually only incidentally, like it's only like accidentally the case that it seems as if they're the same word, and which is to say that we just happen to use the same signs for two different things, or maybe many
So-
different things.
So it's like when we're writing papers and we're like we set our definitions at the beginning of the paper. I
Mhm.
don't know. Most people do that. I do that. When I'm writing an actual paper. Like for example, I'd be like, well, I'm going to be referring to chair as a place to sit
Hmm.
instead of it being used as something like a table.
Hmm.
Where that way it's unmistakable that I'm using it as a place to sit rather than using it for any other purpose.
Right, that's right.
So,
and what like
so
the
that's more of what we're talking about here.
and what the ideal sort of like perfect logical language or the scientific language would do is it would basically its grammar and its syntax and its sort of semantics would be arranged in such a way that like each name will only go to one.
Oh, so
Each
a
name will
chair.
only
So
have
everything
one
would
referent.
have to be different.
Right.
But that's not how our language works.
That's right. Well, and indeed that's why he says natural language sucks. That's why that's why the move
mean,
is away from
Science
natural language.
literally has like 10 different senses.
Yeah.
Like there's
Right.
natural science, there's Aristotelian science, there's Hegelian science,
Nature.
there's Platonic science, there's natural science. Yeah, I mean,
The same as the word nature. The word nature means
oh yeah,
that one sign means 30 different things. In our logical language, we're not going to do that. It might still have different senses because the different senses are basically just different possible like criteria for the determination of whether or not the reference is met or not. So like you could perhaps like come up with a bunch of different like property descriptions of the same
Okay.
referent. But like
so
the
it'd be more of setting our sense that we're using rather than like using specific words.
well, and the way that he's so like what the example he gives, he wants a language such that and again he doesn't think he hasn't done this is not what he's claiming, but he would want a language such that every allowable grammatical syntactic union of proper names, so names that actually have a sense and a reference to them, that each of those is themselves something with a proper name and a reference to it. So you can't just willy-nilly combine horn and horse together. The syntax of the language itself would in some sense prohibit that.
Strange.
Or circle and square, the syntax of the language itself would prohibit that. Because square has a sense and a reference, circle has a sense and a reference. They shouldn't be allowed to combine, though, because they're not combinable.
So it's like, hmm. So it's just basically treating things like oil and water.
Yeah, on a
Where they
syntactic
can't-
level, yeah, like
yeah,
that
yeah.
somehow like, and again, like it's not at all clear how such a thing would actually even exist or
Yeah,
what that
yeah.
what sense that would actually even make. But like that would be the ideal, because then you would stop running into these all these pseudo entities, these fake entities that seemingly are subjects of our language that therefore seemingly exist or seemingly are metaphysical entities.
Well, this is a fun. I think I'm understanding Frege a little bit better because every time I've been exposed to Frege, it's been an absolute nightmare. So
Yeah, my hope is at the very least that like I come at analytic philosophy from such a different direction that it's at least like helpful to understand.
and see the thing is like we've always been taught analytic philosophy and we've never been told we've been taught analytic
Mhm.
philosophy. So
Yeah.
like understanding where all of the things that we've been taught come from makes a lot of sense. I just wish it would have been done sooner. Because
Yeah.
I mean, most of the papers I write are like a weird mix between continental and analytic because I
Mhm.
use analytic stuff, but then I also try to do the concrete whole thing as well.
Yeah, right.
So it's so maybe that's why my papers don't make sense. I've never been told that, but